Okay, ladies and gentlemen, back to the forum. We'll move on to panel discussion 3, the democratic supply chain and existing global trade system, collision and coexistence. And now please welcome our moderator, president of the Prospect Foundation, Dr. Lai, and panelist, Professor Tsai Ming-Fang. And okay, now I'll turn the floor to our moderator, Dr. Lai, please.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you again. It's me again here for today. And this is the session regarding the supply chain security safety and also its relationship with the existing global trade system. I think the pandemic sort of highlight the issue about the supply chain safety, in which that people started to realize that the production concentrate too much on one places, very much could be vulnerable should that place been under the certain contingencies. So the pandemic itself highlight the issue, drive home the point about that, especially when China become the global manufacturers, global factories. Then the problem within China, when that happened, that the global supply chain will be affected. But there is also another ongoing trend parallel to that. It was about supply chain security, in which the how to build a trusted supply chain, that is very important. But then those two concepts, in comparison with the normal or orthodox economic discussion of the day that we have, which focus on the cost and trying to get the production through the relative low cost and to streamline the whole supply chain development. Then what we found out is that the supply chain security and safety requirement and the economic logic about for the low cost has its own contradictions. But of course, there's also could harmonize the two together. So the session is about the discussion on those important issues. And today, we are very glad to have three distinguished panelists. The first one on my left-hand side is Professor Tsai Ming-Fang. He is the Department of Industrial Economics from Tamkang University. And second, he will be followed by the Mr. Martijn Rasser. Dr. Martijn Rasser is Senior Fellow and Director and Technology of National Security Program for the Center of New American Security. And the third panelist is Dr. Fukunari Kimura. He's a professor and a faculty of the economics at the Keio University and also the chief economist, Economic Research Institute for ASEAN and East Asia, ERIA. So without further ado, Dr. Tsai Ming-Fang, please.
Thank you, Dr. I-Chung, Lai's introduction and the invitation. I'm very happy to join this dialogue. And today I want to emphasize some cohesion and coexistence between the democratic supply chain and the existing global trade system. Actually, I think because the global trade system today is depending too much on China, so I want to change the title. You can say the democratic supply chain and the China. So there exist many coalitions between the democratic supply chain and the existing global trade system. First, I think the most important is the human right, or the weaker human rights in China. This is because we always ignore the human right. And so in China, we know that many people, they have the low wage, and the labor environment is not good. So if we can increase the wage and if we can improve the labor environment, the total production cost will increase. So if the total production cost increase, then we know we can emphasize the human rights importance, the labor rights importance. So if we know the human rights importance, and then the coalition is the democratic supply chain. The democracy emphasize the importance of the human right. Okay, so if we can have a reasonable wage rate, and then you can reflect the human right. Okay, and the third is just as the Dr. I-Chung mentioned. Now, because if we want to develop a democratic supply chain, we need to pay the cost for supply chain restructuring. Yeah, so the costs include you need to find another security place, or you must find another. You must emphasize the importance of the cybersecurity. The cybersecurity, you should pay the cost. And in China, if you emphasize the importance of the cybersecurity, I think the cybersecurity in China, they never noticed this issue. Okay, so an increase in the total in the production cost, I think is another correlation between the democratic supply chain and the existing global trade systems. Okay, so in the democratic supply chain, many people they scared if we do the supply chain restructuring. For example, in the Taiwanese firm, they should pay more cost. But so if you should pay more cost, and then they scare that the economic competitiveness will become low. But actually, we should rethink an important issue is the price of the low price. The low price, why we can enjoy the low price? Because we ignore the importance of the human right. Why we can buy a low price of a cloth from many manufacturing goods. This is because many people ignore the Uyghurs' human right. Okay, so if we emphasize the importance of the democracy, you should pay the cost. If you think this is very important, and then you will reject the product from the Xinjiang or the product from the China. Okay, so I think there is no such things as a free lunch. This is because when you do everything, you should pay the opportunity cost. So if we enjoy the low price, so who pay the opportunity cost? I think now is the China's people, not China's government. Okay, so when you analyze the democratic supply chain, between the analysis of democratic supply chain and the economic and the global system, we should rethink the difference between the monetary benefits and the non-monetary benefits. If the democracy countries think the democratic supply chain is very important, I think these countries cannot only seek the benefits, they also should pay more attention on the human rights. Okay, and finally, the democratic supply chain and between the democratic supply chain and the existing global trade system, I think three factors can make the global trade system sustainable. Which three factors? The first is the fair trade. I think the Trump always emphasized the importance of the fair trade, because only the fair trade, and then we can have the free trade. Because the fair trade, you can make everyone can decide, can join the price decision. So include the friends and the consumers, they can have the fair position, can decide the price. So this is the Adam Smith emphasized the importance of the invisible hand. And the second is the transparency. I think the transparency is also very important. In the democratic country, I think the transparency is very common. But in China, the transparency is not so common. This is because we know that the data, like the data fraud, or if you make any decision, it's based on the wrong data source, and then you must make the wrong decision. So why many foreign countries, they invest, when the foreign countries invest China, they make many losses. This is because they see the wrong data source. Okay, so now many people, they always discuss when the Chinese the GDP in China will succeed, will succeed the USA, or will be larger than the USA GDP. I think it's not any meaningful. This is because do you know the real data in China economy? If you don't know any real data, and you cannot make this conclusion. Okay, and the third factor, I think, is the reliance. The reliance is very important, because we know that now the China, they follow the rule of the man, or rule of the sea, and the democratic supply chain, they follow the rule of the law. This is a major difference between the democratic supply chain and the global trade system, the existing global trade system. So if we can have the transparency, and you can have the reliance to the investors. So I think, I think in the reliance, now if we want to have a democratic supply chain, if we want to make the existing global trade system sustainable, we should have follow the three factors, and then we can have attract more FDI, like just as like the Taiwan, because our data is transparency. Our data is, I think, follow the our government is reliable. Okay, and in Taiwan, I think we follow the fair trade, and we really follow the rule of the free trade. So I think that Taiwan is an important member in the future democratic supply chain. And finally, if you think the ESG is very important. ESG means the environment and the social and the governments. The governments, I think everybody know, the Xi Jinping now just promote the common prosperity. The common prosperity is the rule of the sea, it's not rule of the law. So it's not follow the ESG. And if the China cannot cannot emphasize the importance of the global warming, And then if you continue to trade with China, I think the trade pattern does not also follow the ESG. Okay, that's today I think between the coexistence and the collision and the coexistence between the democratic supply chain and the existing global trade system. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Tsai Ming-Fang, for your remarks. Professor Tsai Ming-Fang talks about, I think he particularly talked about the democratic supply chain, in which he like to include the elements of human rights as well as other value-based system as one of the criteria to establish the kind of supply chain, or the requirement for the supply chain to respect those values. It just makes me think about in the past when Taiwan were talking about the Taiwan investment in China, the former Secretary General President Office, Professor Chen Shimeng, once talked about the national security tax. 国安税, national security tax regarding that, because what happened if those businessmen and the result and the cost is going to be the state need to come out and assist about what's happening to them. So I think this is something that's worthy to explore more. And next, I'd like to invite Dr. Martijn Rasser, Senior Fellow and Director, Technology and National Security Program for the CNAS. Dr. Rasser, please.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lai, and it's a real pleasure to be here with Dr. Tsai and Dr. Kimura for this important discussion. So what I thought I would do is start off with talking a little bit about how I'm thinking about what national security means in this context. And then I'll give two specific examples of how that applies to specific supply chains, but I think they would apply equally to the examples that Dr. Tsai just gave. So for one, I believe that national security must be redefined for this era of strategic competition, right? So this is a competition centered on technology, how technologies are developed, protected, and applied. And technology leading countries will gain economic power, political power, and military strength. Those countries will then also determine how technologies are used. And so traditional constructs of society require a rethink as a result. So what were once conceived of as separate areas of focus, such as security for energy, food, climate, and military technologies, should instead be considered as part of a single multidimensional national security. And I see four developments as to why this is necessary. So one is the fundamental linkage between national security and economic security. And there's a few examples of major geopolitical entities that are thinking along these lines. And so the once distinct boundaries between economic and national security have very much dissipated over the years. One example is the United States, where the 2017 National Security Strategy made the distinct statement that economic security is national security. European Union leaders have outlined a vision of strategic autonomy and digital sovereignty to secure its long-term interests and competitiveness. And of course, China's President Xi Jinping has declared that scientific and technological competition is the main battleground of global power rivalry. So two is the growing clout of the private sector in critical infrastructure and technological innovation. The infrastructure required to keep society running and militaries operating, power, transport, communications is increasingly controlled by corporation and thus outside the direct purview of national governments. So the role of the private sector is set to grow even further as it's increasingly responsible for developing the technologies, enabling the maintenance, upgrades, and overhaul of this infrastructure. Three is that the norms and standards for technology use are more and more impacting all facets of society. Social media are an effective vector for disinformation campaigns designed to aggravate societal fissures and tarnish the legitimacy of democratic institutions. Regulations on surveillance technology are needed to strike the balance between internal security and safeguarding personal liberties, and norms to promote a free and open cyberspace, particularly to establish an enforceable rules-based order in cyberspace, will be necessary to establish a sound foundation for realistic cybersecurity. For emerging technologies are going to be essential to addressing long-term societal challenges such as food security and climate change. And as these challenges are inextricably linked to countries' long-term health and prosperity, they should be considered as elemental to national security. So redefine national security for this period of technological competition should be rooted in the goal to empower its citizens, compete economically, and secure its national interests without having to compromise its values and sovereignty. And that's why this discussion about supply chains is so important, because I think we're all seeing now that the pendulum of globalization has swung too far in one direction, where we are all too reliant on single sources for key inputs in our economies and our national security interests. And one of these countries that features so prominently, of course, is China, an autocratic nation of revisionist power whose long-term vision and goals is very much at odds of that of the democratic countries of the world. And so there are two examples of key supply chains that I want to provide you that both underscore the importance of addressing these vulnerabilities, but also pointing to how complex and intricate the supply chain problem is and the types of things that we have to think about in order to address these problems. Now, the first example I give you is more straightforward and more simple than many of the other supply chain issues, and that's pertaining to rare earth elements and critical minerals. So here the problem is straightforward in the sense that there's plenty of deposits of these minerals around the world. The problem is primarily that we are highly dependent on China for processing these materials and producing end products such as the magnets that we need for our electric vehicles and medical equipment and a lot of our defense items. So, of course, what needs to happen in order to address those vulnerabilities is to have a group of like-minded countries agree to work together to open up new mines, establish new processing facilities. But there's an additional step that needs to be taken, and this points to a new form of industrial policy that a lot of countries have not dealt with or contemplated before. Because China is so dominant in this industry, if we're going to encourage companies in the like-minded democracies to enter this market space, we need to have some sort of government guarantee that we will have a financial safety net for them. Because inevitably what's going to happen as soon as Beijing sees economic competition from new entrants into the market, they're going to artificially drive down the prices, just as they have with aluminum and steel and solar panels. And this is why the supply chain problem is so difficult, because it's not just a matter of remapping. There's also a rethink in the types of industrial policies that our governments have to be willing to take in order to make it sustainable. A much more difficult example is that of semiconductors. And here, of course, Taiwan plays such an integral role in making this a reality. Taiwan, of course, dominates semiconductor fabrication, particularly at the leading edge. But at the same time, there's other key players, right? The United States is dominant in semiconductor design. The Dutch firm ASML has the leading source of EUV lithography equipment, and Japan and South Korea are very important players in and of their own rights. So here, in order to successfully remap semiconductor supply chains in a manner that is effective, this requires a very delicate and strategic partnership amongst the leading countries in this field. And that in and of itself is much more difficult to do. And in order to have a constructive dialogue on what it takes to make these supply chains truly democratic and truly viable is going to require a level of cooperation and collaboration that, frankly, we have not seen before in the realm of technology. These are the types of discussions that we need to be having now, and I commend the Prospect Foundation for hosting this event in order for us to have this initial dialogue on how we can make this happen, because it's such an important problem. And frankly, if we don't address it credibly and urgently, we're going to face a very difficult time in the coming decades as we face a rising China who's very much eager to dominate all these technology spaces that we're talking about and take advantage of the fact that they have this control over these supply chains. And so with that, I will turn it over back to you, Dr. Lai. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Rasser, for your remarks, and especially you extended, broadened the concept about national security to other forms of the security, including the economic security. And so that we will go through that. And next, I will invite Professor Fukunari Kimura from the Keio University for your remarks. Professor Kimura, please.
Thank you very much for kind introduction. It's great pleasure. It's great pleasure for me to be invited here. Thank you very much. I'm an economist, particularly the trade economist. So I like to talk about the geographical tension and the supply chain issues from the viewpoint of private sector. You know, that Japan is probably perceived geographical tension a bit less compared with in Taiwan, I guess, but private sector is really worrying about what's going on in with the geographical tension. So how they would deal with that, and how the government would respond. Actually, government response may not be quite adequate from the viewpoint of private sector. So I like to talk about these issues. Factory Asia is actually having three kinds of challenges. Those are interrelated, but all of them are pretty serious in the short run and also in the long run. COVID-19, geopolitical tension, digital technology, and environmental concern. So if we pick up geopolitical tension, so that started out with a relatively simplistic tariff war, but now coming into confrontation between superpowers, or maybe sort of tension between the different political regime. So then the other side of the coin is the weakening of the rule-based trading regime from the viewpoint of private sector. But if we look at the economic links, the presence of China in trade seems to be even bigger, getting bigger through COVID-19 pandemic. So now, very recently, the Chinese economy seems to be slowing down to some extent. But if you look at the trade statistics and others, and also the performance of Japanese affiliates in China, actually, China is still an important business partner for many firms in Japan, in the US too, and also in Taiwan too. So private sector thinks that decoupling is likely to be partial at the end. So how they can seek a sort of degree of freedom in their business, and that's sort of a great concern for them. So how to set the scope of decoupling and keep the free and predictable trading regime. So it's not just a sort of average barriers, height of barriers, but a very important thing is reducing uncertainty for the private sector. How politics can do that really would affect the future of supply chains in Asia. So from the viewpoint of a Japanese private sector, I think that there are three different layers in terms of trade and investment with national security. The first tier is a relatively well-defined trade or investment explicitly connected with hardcore national security. That would include, say, export control and others. So Wasana Arrangement and others are there. So those are relatively well defined. So we have, for Japanese, we had a very bitter memory of Toshiba Kongsberg scandal in 1989, 87. And also very recently, we had a Korean case. But so I think we have to make this very straight and do these kind of basic obligation. So that's number one. Number two, try to avoid or reduce policy risks coming from China. Say industries and firms with sensitive technologies using rare earth or some of the personal protective equipment. Actually, those are already going out of China to some extent. So some limited scope of decoupling is already going on. So certainly a private sector is very sensitive for the balance between the efficiency or cost versus risk management. So that's their own decision in many cases that whether or not they would stay in China or keeping business with China or not. So so we have some distance from China, but still very close to China. So I think we are having ASEAN +1 strategy for a long time already. So the operation in China and operation in other parts of the world, including ASEAN, are I think pretty much decoupled already. So that's really needed here. So for number two, certainly we have to make a judgment by our own judgment, and so mostly by private judgment we are doing this, and we have some push coming from the government to make these subsidies for reshoring and relocation. But the subsidies are not quite important in quantity, actually. So probably the very important role for the government is to provide proper information for the private sector to make a judgment. The third one, we have to go with the US. This part is a little bit tricky for our private sector. So definition of national security and sensitive technologies has been expanded, and also the borderline is blurred, partially intentionally. So linked to hardcore security, that's relatively easy to think of. But once we talk about technology competition, then what's the borderline of that there? Human rights. Xinjiang's case is obvious in a sense, but we would have much more borderline cases in the future that generates a lot of uncertainty for the private sector. The another is alliance relationship. Certainly, Japanese really think much of the alliance relationship with the US, but the US policy is not quite understandable sometimes, even for Japanese. And then whether or not we would follow the US or not, we have to make a judgment from the viewpoint of the government, and that generates uncertainty for private sector. So private companies would like to know the scope of decoupling, but the politics does not really allow to do that perfectly. The last point, I think I like to talk about the mega FTAs a little bit. We do not have much too big hope for mega FTAs, of course. But in the past 5 years, I think probably we are expanding the role of mega FTAs. In the past, we are just talking about further liberalization and the international rule making. But recently, we emphasized the possible function of mega FTAs for reducing policy risks and for defending the rule-based trading regime. So in the case of RCEP, for example, the liberalization level was low, the international rule-making role is sort of minimal, but the last two roles could be important for RCEP. In RCEP, China is there, and we have annual ministerial meeting, and we have a committee and subcommittees under that. So it's a sort of ASEAN type structure, institutional structure. At least we can have chances to talk with China directly if we have some sort of uneasy policy risks coming from China, for example. So, and also in case of CPTPP now, neither the US nor China is a member, but in the middle powers in between, we have a sort of a gathering for trying to defend the rule-based trading regime. So I think those are going to be more and more important in, when we talk about the role of mega FTAs. In case of a CPTPP accession, maybe you are following the news too. For the UK, the process is going on. We are still talking about many things I heard, but the negotiation is going on very actively. In case of China, a formal request came on September 16th, for Taiwan, September 22nd. And then recently, I had some information on the Chinese side that actually my judgment so far is that the preparation level of China does not seem to be enough. It may not even reach the decision to commence the process. So one is a sort of a setting of negotiation. That's an accession negotiation rather than setting up a new agreement. So the new entrant would have some sort of harsh, difficult, giving a full scale of requests. And also in terms of contents, SOEs, labor, e-commerce, and also liberalization, including government procurement, I think pretty difficult for China to meet the requirements. And also politics are certainly a little bit more complicated. So I think that would come recently. So I hope that we would have some sort of soft landing, just take time, and everybody would forget about China's application. That's the best solution, I think. But that may not be the case. So what could Taiwan do on this issue? I think that's one thing that maybe we can talk about. Then we'd like to know what the US would do for Asia. I think a lot of uncertainty is coming from the US now. Indo-Pacific idea, I think so far we have very weak economic basis, and it doesn't make sense not to include, if not including ASEAN, how we can set up a sort of a structure. Everything is uncertain. So we'd like to see what's going on at the front of a mega FTA formation too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kimura-san, for your remarks. And the issue you are talking about, the supply chain, especially regarding how China, and that also later on about your description regarding the future of the mega FTA. Those are worthy of the further discussions. So right now we're open for the question from the floor. Right now I do not have any question from the online audience. So anyone on the floor would like to ask questions, right now is your opportunity. Is Eric again? All right, you make yourself known. Yes, go ahead, Eric.
Yes, this is Eric again. Well, thank you for all the panelists for the fantastic questions. This is an important topic. The Project 2049 Institute is heavily engaged in this issue broadly, especially looking at U.S.-Taiwan defense industrial cooperation and supply chain security, working on that with our Taiwan partners. So this is a very important topic for us. You know, talking about supply chain security, you know, looking at two areas, or looking at resiliency in particular, and the critical role that Taiwan plays, as Mr. Rasser pointed out. You know, two questions I wanted to pose to the panel is, first, on existing supply chains, Taiwan doesn't have a security clearance system like the US does, or Japan in some pockets. And I see that as a barrier for some industry or more sensitive technologies, especially when you kind of go into the military or defense equipment side of it. So for a security clearance system, what are the barriers to overcome that in Taiwan? And potentially, how would that impact supply chain security broadly with, for example, or supply chain resiliency with the United States and Japan? And the second part is how to leverage existing Taiwan technologies into the supply chains of tomorrow. What are the opportunities and challenges for future supply chain resiliency and security? Thank you.
Okay, so Eric, I think your question about the first one is actually about the what are going to be the governmental adjustment or reform in order to address the security issues there. Is that am I rephrasing your question correct?
Yeah, yes. I guess kind of especially looking at the challenges that are there, because I think that these conversations have been brought up. But there's a gap between discussing it or having a strategy to implementation. What are the challenges that Taiwan needs to overcome in order to get to, for example, having a security clearance system that, you know, in the same vein that the United States has, broadly speaking, for government and industry?
All right, I think those are tough questions, and probably they are aiming at our Taiwan's panelists. Try to answer the best you can. Of course, I know you're not from the government, and you are not entitled to answer them as on behalf of the government, but you could raise your own perspective and suggestion. Dr. Tsai?
Okay. I think if we want to increase the supply chain security, I think the most important is just as our government always emphasize that we need more funds become larger, become stronger, and these funds can develop another supply chain. It means that in Taiwan, if we have many supply chains, not only concentrated on the semiconductor supply chain, we can have another supply chain like we can have another cybersecurity equivalent supply chain, or we can have another cross supply chain. And if we can have many supply chains, and these supply chains will become a network of a supply chain, so we can try to establish the network of the supply chain security. So I think it's a tough question, but we can just try, just do it, and we can try to develop one or two industry and make our funds become larger. And then I think many foreign countries also want to try to cooperate with Taiwan. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tsai. I believe that what the Eric said and also indicated that in order for Taiwan to be a part of the certain sectorial security supply chain, such as defense industry with the United States, some preparatory measure by Taiwan itself is mandatory. The security clearance system that we haven't really established. And also, in order to establish this one, how could that be accommodated to our many of the manufacturers? They are the small and medium small size industry, which many of them they cannot afford the kind of the security clearance measures on their own, and because those are only the bigger enterprises, they are able to do that. So those are the issues that how the government will be able to do. So those are the challenges that we have. And Next, I think I will just abuse my privilege as the moderator. I'll pose the questions to all three of our panelists. The issue is something that's have been deep in my mind, thinking about, but I never got any clear answer for it. Is that the supply chain security as well as supply chain safety, which supply chain safety sometimes has been the term as the resilience, supply chain resilience or supply chain diversification issues. But those two, they are when they started to become the focus of conversation as today, they were after many of the mega FTAs that established. So for example, the CPTPP or the TPP before that, RCEP and others, even the WTO discussions. When the economic agreement came out, the supply chain, which has a strong indication regarding industrial policies, that hasn't really been integrated into those agreements. So the issue is that, first of all, philosophically speaking, how are we able to tackle the challenge from others that the supply chain, although there's a national security concerns, but the implementation of it is actually another phase about the trying to penetrate, insert the kind of industrial policy into it, and how we're going to respond to those. The second issue is that are we able to, is there any way that we could actually harmonize or streamline the requirement for the supply chain security as well as supply chain safety issues into the current FTA that at hand? How to make this one have FTA also be able to address the supply chain safety security issues through the articles or the agreement that existed in the FTA. I do know that, yes, USMCA to a certain extent addressed some. For example, about the non-market economy countries, how that required other countries to be informed or to be able to know beforehand. But generally, how the current FTA that is a hand that could also be asked to accommodate the requirement for this. So first, Dr. Tsai, please.
I think if we want to let the democratic supply chain make the democratic factor into the FTA, I think now the other chance is the Indo-Pacific economic framework. I think now, just as mentioned by the Japan panelist mentioned that the China also, the China and the both the Taiwan and the China, they just want to join the CPTPP. But if the CPTPP allow the China to join the CPTPP, and then it must prove that the democratic supply chain will lose. Yeah. So if the CPTPP can just deny, not deny, if the CPTPP members can reject the China to join the CPTPP, and then they, this is the chance to prove that the CPTPP noticed that the democratic supply chain. Okay, so I think this is very, this is a tough question because the democratic, we need a cost. The cost, it means that the human rights or the labor right or the environment, if we want to have a good environment, if we want to have a healthy labor environment, both this good environment, we need to pay a huge cost. The huge cost will increase the production cost, and then it will reduce the economic competitiveness. Okay, so many people think there is a contradiction between the democratic supply chain and the FTA. But actually, in the economic theory, we often emphasize if we want to sell a free trade, you must guarantee the trade is fair. If the trade is fair, just as the Dr. I-Chung Lai mentioned, the democracy is very important. Okay, so we can expect the CPTPP, they can consider the importance of the democracy, but we cannot force them. We should continue to say to emphasize the importance of the democracy. Okay, that's my answer.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Tsai. And then I will ask Dr. Rasser, would you like to give us your thought about this?
Sure, absolutely. Well, I'm not a trade expert by any stretch, but my understanding of all these free trade agreements is that they're predicated on the status quo of global supply chains. And in order to craft what we're referring to as democratic supply chains, that's going to require a restructuring in order to introduce the resilience that we're looking for. So in order to do that, that would require a grouping of like-minded democratic nations to actually work together to remap those supply chains. And that, by my understanding, would have to take place outside of free trade agreements, and it would have to involve very close coordination amongst all those governments, but then, of course, also with the relevant stakeholders in industry that are directly affected by any type of restructuring of those supply chains. So in order to achieve true change in global supply chains such that we can ensure that they are democratic, that they are resilient, that they have the appropriate levels of security and some form of redundancy in them so that there's a surge capacity, that's going to require, I think, a whole new mechanism outside of the existing free trade agreements in order to make that happen. And that type of political will that's going to require is, difficult to achieve, but also very necessary. So I would encourage the governments of the tech-leading democracies, to include Taiwan, the allies in the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and North America, to have those discussions now about how to best achieve that.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rasser. And then I'd like to invite Dr. Kimura about this issue.
Yeah, so from the viewpoint of trade economists, international trade commercial policies, including FTAs or even WTO, I think international trade commercial policies do not deal with democracy or national security directly. So basically talking about economic efficiency, and then the private sector can do anything within the rule. I think that's the basic structure over there. But certainly national security is very, very important. That's a sort of different value. Because of that, we have in GATT, we have Article 21 that is trying to reconcile two different values, economic efficiency and national security. But in GATT 21, Article 21, actually, whether or not some sort of policy measures taken by a certain country is for national security or not, and that is really justifiable or not, that is going to be pretty much self-judgment. So that's GATT Article 21. So that's why we have a sort of conflict over there, that there's a private sector would like to do everything, but national security side, the definition of national security is blurred. So that's why we are having a sort of weakening of rule-based trading regime. So that started in many countries, including the US, actually. So we have Section 232 talking about trade restriction and others based on based on the national security reasons, say steel products, aluminum products, and even possibly automobiles under national security concern. I think that's from a viewpoint of common sense of trade economists, that is too far. But certainly we have some sort of really sensitive products, certainly so. So we really have to set some sort of borderline over there. That's the issue in international commercial policies right now. For CPTPP, CPTPP does not ask a political system directly, does not require anything for democracy directly. But we have a labor chapter over there, and then the applicants should obey the ILO declaration. That includes the prohibition of forced labor and also child labor too. So in case of China, possibly they cannot really clear the labor chapter because of that. And that's a sort of background. So I think, yeah, for the first question, sort of a security clearance system, particularly directly related to national security, I think that's extremely important. So we have Wasana Convention and other related conventions talking about, say, materials and parts and components and others potentially used for some weapons and others. We have a sort of export control and other things. Certainly, that's a sort of minimum that we really have to reconcile, get a sort of reconciliation between economic logic in international commercial policies and national security concern. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Kimura-san. You mentioned about Wasana Agreement. That just reminds me that this agreement that was sort of dinosaur during the Cold War era. Right now, that it reminds people that the China is still a communist party of the Marxism, so that the Wasana Agreement at that time that it was designed during that era, right now seems to have this application in today's world as well. Probably we have the time for just one question, if not from the floor. Well, let me ask again, but this time for our Japan and friends from the United States. For Dr. Rasser, I think when you earlier in your comment talk about the economic security and the national security, and there was a you can say that's outdated assertion that the people argue that when the closer economic engagement between the countries will make those countries less likely to engage in war. And by extension, that they argue that the kind of the frequent economic cooperation will improve the national security, particularly with your enemy or the country that have a threat against you. Because you trade more, you engage more, then that country probably will not do that much harm against you. Those were the argument in the past. But right now, I do not know that when if the argument like this resurface, what is your answer about it? And for Professor Kimura-san, the issue about the China, Japan, and Taiwan in terms of the trade, I remember 20 years ago, when Japan's company come to Taiwan and talk about the issue, they were thinking about how Taiwan could be the window or model for them, for Japan's company to being able to engage in China, because that was the time that the Taiwan business was considered to have the kind of magic wand to be able to go through all the very difficult and negotiating within China and get profit there. So that was the period back then. And now it seems that the whole atmosphere is very different. But then how would those Japanese companies look at Taiwan businessmen in China? And at that time that the Taiwan was considered to be the window for Japan to learn or to copy about the business behavior in China. If right now the whole atmosphere is different, how would the Japanese company look at Taiwan in terms of the Japan's trade relation with China? So two questions. First, Dr. Rasser, please.
Well, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I think clearly the notion that China would, liberalize and open up and slowly become more democratic as it was integrated in the global economic system, did not happen. And in fact, the opposite has happened. And yeah, in part, that is wishful thinking, right? There's always this notion that greater integration, economic integration would lead to closer alignment on a whole host of issues. But just as it did not happen with China in the late 20th and early 21st century, the same thing happened with the British Empire and Germany in the early 20th century. I do think, however, that when it comes to like-mindedness in terms of values, political ideology, that yes, greater economic integration does indeed help. The European Union is a good example, and I think the same reason why the United States is looking to integrate more closely through new international groupings such as the Quad and AUKUS. Those types of relationships do in fact help because they are like-minded democracies. Now, granted, they're still very different countries, of course, but that foundation of political values and democratic ideals, that does a lot to unify, and that's going to be the focus area right now. Ultimately, yes, in retrospect, allowing China to join the WTO, it ended up being wishful thinking, which is unfortunate, but at least relevant policymakers are fully cognizant of that issue now and are taking action to make sure that our collective futures will be more secure by taking the action necessary to at least partially decouple, but also make sure that our economic competitiveness is such that we can have an effective counterbalance to what China is doing, not just within its own borders, but around the world.
Thank you, Dr. Rasser. And Dr. Kimura?
Yeah, certainly in the 1990s and early 2000s, Japanese firms were a sort of infant stage of coming into Chinese market. So in many industries, probably Japanese firms get very important information or help coming from Taiwanese companies. But certainly after that, there are many factories, offices, and anything of Japan inside China right now. So they are gaining their own experience to some extent. But still, I think that the business links between Japanese and the Taiwanese companies, particularly machinery industries, is very tight. So I think it's very important business partners still. And so that is our direct trade and investment. At the same time, say activities in ASEAN and other places too. So I think for Japanese businesses, still Taiwanese are very important.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Kimura, for your remarks. And since the time is up, so I just conclude this session, and let us all thank our three panelists for their insightful remarks and very penetrating the issues of their concern. Thank you very much.